They laughed at the homeless veteran who bought a shack for $1. What he saw inside changed his life. If stories of quiet courage warm your heart, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from tonight. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts by the fire, and maybe yours will be the one that carries this further than we ever imagined. There are moments in a man's life when the whole world seems to lean in and wait, holding its breath to see what he will do next. And for Thomas Whitmore, that moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, when the sky hung low and gray over the county courthouse steps, and the auctioneer's voice cut through the cold like the crack of a branch under snow. Thomas stood at the back of the small crowd, hands deep in the pockets of a coat that had seen better decades, his shoulders hunched not from age. He was only 47, but from the particular kind of weariness that comes from carrying invisible weight, the sort that no one else can see, but everyone somehow feels when they pass you on the street. The auctioneer was selling off abandoned properties, tax-delinquent parcels no one wanted, and the crowd was sparse. A few real estate speculators in clean boots, a young couple dreaming of fixing something up, an old farmer chewing tobacco and squinting at the listings like he was reading someone else's mail. Thomas had walked 7 miles to be there, following a notice he'd seen taped inside the window of the general store, and he carried in his chest pocket exactly $3.47, which was everything he had in the world except for what he wore and what he carried in the green canvas pack leaning against his leg. When the auctioneer called out Lot 17, a structure described only as one dwelling, condition as is, no utilities, forest access, 10 acres, a murmur of laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of laughter that isn't quite cruel but isn't quite kind either, the laughter of people who have seen the pictures and know that dwelling is a generous word for what amounts to 4 walls barely standing and a roof that's mostly prayer. The auctioneers started the bidding at $500, then dropped to $200 when no one raised a hand, then $100, then $50, and the laughter grew a little louder, a little more comfortable, because there's something about watching things fall apart that makes people feel better about their own lives, even if they never say so out loud. Thomas raised his hand. $1, he said, and his voice was quiet but clear, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that you don't need to shout to be heard if you mean what you say. The laughter stopped, then started again, harder this time, and someone behind him muttered something about charity cases and wasted time. The auctioneer looked at Thomas for a long moment, and in that look was a whole conversation, pity and doubt, and something that might have been respect, all tangled together like roots beneath the snow. The gavel came down. Sold to the gentleman in the gray coat, the auctioneer said, and just like that, Thomas owned something again. He walked away from the courthouse with a key in his hand and a slip of paper with directions to a place he'd never seen, and behind him the laughter faded into the cold air, became part of the wind, and was gone. The snow had started to fall by then, small dry flakes that hissed against his coat and caught in his hair, which was going gray at the temples, though he didn't think of himself as old. Only tired, only trying, only still here. The road out of town followed a creek that ran dark and fast between banks of frozen mud, and Thomas walked beside it for an hour, maybe more, until the houses thinned and disappeared and there was nothing but forest on both sides, pine and hemlock standing close together like old men at a funeral. His boots crunched in the gravel, and the sound was good, solid, real, the kind of sound that reminds you that you're still moving forward even when you can't see where you're going. If this moment is touching something in you, stay with us. There's more to tell, and your company makes all the difference out here in the quiet. The cold had a sound, Thomas thought, as he stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at what he'd bought for $1. It was the sound of silence pressing in from all sides, so complete and heavy that it felt like something you could hold in your hands if you were careful enough. The shack crouched in the center of the clearing like an animal that had lain down to rest and never gotten up again, its boards weathered to the color of ash, its windows dark and empty as the sockets of a skull, and the roof sagging in the middle where years of snow had bent the beams past the point of resistance. But there was a chimney, and the chimney was stone, and stone lasts longer than wood, longer than hope sometimes, longer than the men who stack it. Thomas walked closer, his boots breaking through the thin crust of ice over the snow, and he circled the structure slowly, touching the walls with his bare hand, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm. The way it had split and weathered but still held together, still stood. There were animal tracks in the snow, deer, maybe a fox, something small that had passed in the night, and he liked knowing that, liked the idea that this place wasn't entirely abandoned, that life still moved through it, even when no one was watching. The door hung crooked on leather hinges so old they'd turned black, and when Thomas pushed it open, the smell that came out was the smell of time itself. Damp wood and mouse nests, and the particular emptiness of a place where people once laughed and argued and cooked breakfast and didn't anymore. He stepped inside, and the floor groaned under his weight but held, and through the broken windows came enough light to see by, thin and gray, and filtered through the clouds that had followed him all the way from town. One room, maybe 12 feet by 12, with a loft built into the rafters and a ladder missing most of its rungs. A stone hearth blackened with old smoke. The mantel carved with initials he couldn't quite make out in the dim light. A table on its side, 2 chairs with broken backs, a shelf that had pulled loose from the wall and spilled whatever it once held onto the floor, tin cans rusted through, a cup with no handle, a piece of cloth that might have been a curtain once. In the corner, a pile of leaves blown in through some gap he couldn't see, and beneath the leaves, the bones of something small, a bird maybe or a squirrel, returned to the earth in its own time. Thomas set his pack down gently, as if the floor were a living thing he didn't want to startle, and he stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides, and he listened. The wind moved through the trees outside with a sound like breathing, slow and steady, and somewhere far off a crow called once and went silent, and Thomas closed his eyes and felt something in his chest loosen just a little, some knot he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. There was a well, he'd noticed, 50 feet from the door, the kind with a rope and bucket, and when he walked over to it and looked down, he could see his own face reflected in the black water far below, distorted and strange, like looking at someone you used to know a long time ago. He dropped a pebble and counted 1, 2, 3, before he heard the splash, and the echo came back up to him cold and clean, and he thought, there's water here, good water, and that's more than I had yesterday. Maybe you know what it's like to stand at the edge of something and feel both the weight of everything you've lost and the lightness of having nothing left to lose. If you do, I hope you'll stay with us a little longer. By the time he'd carried in enough deadfall to start a fire, the afternoon was fading into that particular blue darkness that comes before the real night sets in, and his hands were raw and his shoulders ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that comes from doing something useful, something that will matter in an hour when the cold gets serious. He knelt by the hearth and arranged the wood carefully, smallest twigs first, then kindling, then the larger pieces, building it like his grandfather had taught him 50 years ago when the world was different and he was just a boy who didn't know yet what waiting meant. The fire caught on the third match, and Thomas sat back on his heels and watched it grow, feeding it slowly, letting it find its own strength, and the light that filled the room was the oldest kind of light, the kind that makes every face beautiful and every shadow a story. He heated water in his tin cup, the only one he owned, and when it boiled he added the last of his instant coffee, stirring it with a twig he'd peeled clean, and the smell was so good it almost hurt, rich and dark and full of memory. Mornings in another life, kitchens that belonged to people he used to know, the ordinary grace of sitting down to something warm. On the mantel, where the firelight could touch it, Thomas placed 3 things. A photograph wrapped in clear plastic, creased and faded, showing a woman and a boy who both had his eyes. A purple heart medal on a ribbon, so old the color had nearly gone. And a letter, folded small, that he'd carried for 11 years and never once opened because he already knew what it said, and knowing was enough. Outside, something scratched at the door. Thomas stood slowly, his knees cracking, and crossed to the door and opened it, and there in the snow was a dog, or what was left of a dog, ribs showing, coat matted, one ear torn but eyes bright and steady, watching him with the kind of hope that doesn't ask for much, only a chance. Thomas looked at the dog, and the dog looked at him, and without saying a word Thomas stepped aside and let him in. He opened his last can of soup, chicken noodle, the cheap kind, and poured half into his cup for himself and half into the tin lid for the dog, and they ate together by the fire, neither of them making a sound, And when they were done, the dog lay down on the floor as close to the hearth as he could get without burning, and Thomas sat with his back against the wall, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something that might have been peace, or at least the beginning of it, the faint outline of what peace might look like if you squinted. The fire burned low, and Thomas fed it one piece at a time, careful not to waste what he'd gathered, knowing that tomorrow he'd need to gather more, and the day after that, and the day after that. And this was how time would be measured now, not in hours or appointments or the things other people expected of him, but it would split in water carried in the slow, necessary work of staying alive and maybe, if he was lucky, staying human too. The dog. Thomas had started thinking of him as Sam, though he didn't know why. The name had just arrived in his mind, fully formed like something he'd remembered rather than invented. Sam twitched in his sleep, his paws moving as if he were running through some dream landscape that was kinder than the world he'd woken up in. And Thomas watched him and felt a strange fellowship, the recognition that passes between creatures who have both been lost and are now, against all reasonable odds, found. The night deepened, and with it came a cold that had weight and intention, the kind of cold that finds every crack and gap and settles in like an uninvited guest who knows you're too tired to fight. Thomas pulled on every layer he owned. 2 shirts, a sweater with holes in the elbows, the gray coat that smelled of smoke and rain, and still he could see his breath in the firelight, small clouds that appeared and vanished, marking time in a way that felt both ancient and immediate. He thought about the people at the auction, their laughter still ringing faintly in some corner of his memory, and he found that he didn't blame them. Not really. They were only doing what people do when they're afraid of becoming what they see, which is to say they were only protecting themselves from the knowledge that any of us, at any moment, might lose everything we think makes us who we are. He'd been one of them once, or someone like them, a man with a house and a job and a wife and a son, a man who paid his bills on time and mowed his lawn on Saturdays and believed, without ever quite saying so, that good things happen to good people, and the world made sense if you just work hard enough. And then the deployments, 3 of them, each one a little longer, a little darker, a little harder to come back from. And when he finally did come back for good, he discovered that the man who had left was not the same man who returned, and the people who had waited for him had been waiting for someone else, someone who no longer existed, and no amount of trying could bring that person back. The divorce papers had arrived on a Thursday, and he'd signed them without argument, because what could he say that would change anything? What words existed that could explain the way some part of him had stayed overseas in the dust and heat and the terrible clarity of fear, and the part that came home was just going through the motions, a shadow performing the role of a man? If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own life, like you're watching yourself from somewhere far away and can't quite find the way back, tell me about it in the comments, because maybe we're not as alone as we think we are. After the divorce came the joblessness, the drinking, the slow unraveling of everything he'd built, and he'd watched it happen with a kind of detached fascination, as if it were happening to someone else, someone he used to know. The house went first, then the truck, then the small apartment, then the room, and finally there was just the pack and the coat and the road. And he discovered that the road, at least, didn't judge you, didn't expect you to be anyone other than who you were, which was nobody at all. But tonight, in this broken shack with a fire burning and a dog sleeping at his feet and a roof over his head that he owned free and clear for the price of $1, Thomas felt something shifting, some tectonic plate deep inside him, grinding slowly into a new position. He wasn't sure what to call it. It wasn't happiness, that was too simple, too bright, but it was something like purpose, or maybe just the absence of despair, which is sometimes the same thing. He took the photograph from the mantel and held it close to the fire, studying the faces. Julie, her hair shorter than she wore it now, probably, her smile caught mid-laugh at some joke he could no longer remember. And Jacob, 8 years old in the picture, gap-toothed and freckled, and holding a baseball glove that had been a birthday present, and Thomas wondered how tall he'd be now, whether his voice had changed, whether he ever thought about his father, or if Thomas had become just a story, a cautionary tale, a thing that happened to someone else. He put the photograph back, and beside it he set the medal, which felt heavier than it should for such a small piece of metal and ribbon, and beside that the letter, which he touched once with his fingertip, and then left alone. The wind picked up outside, and the shack groaned and settled, and Sam lifted his head briefly, ears alert, then lowered it again, reassured by some signal Thomas couldn't hear. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced, and somewhere in the forest an owl called, low and mournful, and was answered by another farther off, and Thomas thought about all the creatures out there in the darkness, surviving, enduring, making their way through the cold one night at a time. And he thought, I'm one of them now. And the thought wasn't sad, only true. He must have dozed, because when he opened his eyes, the fire had burned down to embers, and the cold had crept closer, and Sam was pressed against his leg, sharing warmth. And through the broken window he could see stars, thousands of them, more than he'd seen in years, spread across the sky like salt spilled on black cloth. He fed the fire, watched it catch and flare, and settled back against the wall. And this time when he closed his eyes, he slept deeply, dreamlessly, the sleep of a man who has traveled a long way and finally stopped. Morning arrived not all at once, but gradually, the way honesty does, the darkness thinning by degrees until Thomas could make out the shapes of things. The hearth, the table, Sam's silhouette against the gray light seeping through the windows, and with the light came the sounds of the forest waking. Birds calling territorially from the pines, the distant knock of a woodpecker working at dead bark, the whisper of wind through branches that still held a few stubborn leaves from the autumn that had passed. Thomas stood, his joints protesting, and stepped outside into air so cold it felt like swallowing needles. And he stood on what might generously be called a porch, 3 warped boards nailed to 2 half-rotted joists. And he breathed, deep and slow, watching his breath plume and dissipate. And he thought, I made it through the night, which was no small thing, which was in fact everything. Sam emerged behind him, stretched in that full-body way dogs have, and trotted off into the trees to conduct his morning business, and Thomas walked to the well and drew up water and drank from his cupped hands, the water so cold it hurt his teeth, tasting of stone and depth and purity, and he thought, this is what the world tastes like when you strip away everything else. This is the flavor of just being alive. He spent the morning working, which is to say he spent it making small improvements that added up to something larger. He found boards in the forest, old lumber from some previous structure that had fallen or been abandoned, and he used a rock for a hammer and nails he straightened with his fingers, and he patched the worst of the gaps in the walls, not beautifully, but functionally, enough to keep some of the wind out when it came from the north. He swept the floor with a branch he'd stripped of twigs, pushing out the leaves and the bones and the evidence of previous tenants, and with each stroke of the improvised broom, he felt himself claiming the space, making it his in the way that only work can make something yours. By midday, he guessed at the time by the angle of the light, having long ago sold the watch that might have told him precisely, Thomas turned his attention to the back of the shack, where a pile of debris had accumulated against the wall, old furniture too broken to use, rotted blankets, a rusted bucket with the bottom gone. He pulled the debris away piece by piece, and as he did, something emerged that he hadn't seen before in the darkness of that first night. A door, low and narrow, fitted so flush with the wall that it had been nearly invisible beneath the accumulated years. The door was swollen with moisture, the wood soft in places, and when Thomas tried the handle, a simple iron loop, it wouldn't budge, the whole thing sealed tight by damp and time and the patient work of decay. He went outside and found a flat stone that might serve as a pry bar, and he worked it into the gap between the door and the frame, gently at first and then with more force, and the wood groaned and something inside creaked, and then all at once the door swung inward on hinges that screamed like things in pain. If this moment is pulling you in, please subscribe. It helps these quiet stories reach others who might need them, and I think maybe you understand why that matters. The smell that came out was different from the rest of the shack, drier, older, layered with sawdust and oil and something else, something almost sweet like dried herbs or old paper. Thomas stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust, and gradually the space beyond revealed itself. A workshop small and narrow, maybe 6 feet by 8, with a single window, so covered in grime that the light coming through was green and strange and submarine. Tools hung on the wall, arranged with a precision that spoke of someone who took pride in order, someone who believed that things should have their place. A saw with a wooden handle worn smooth by use. A plane with its blades still sharp. Chisels of different sizes. A mallet, a T-square. A level made of wood and brass and glass. On a workbench that ran the length of the back wall sat jars of nails and screws, organized by size, and beside them a tobacco tin full of pencils sharpened to perfect points and a straight edge with measurements marked in a careful hand. Thomas stepped inside, moving slowly as if he were entering a church or a grave, and his foot kicked something that rolled across the floor with a hollow sound. A wooden spool for thread, empty now, smooth as bone. He picked it up and turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the way it had been made with care for a purpose that had long since passed, and he set it gently on the workbench where it seemed to belong. In the corner, partly hidden by a drop cloth stiff with age, was a chest, a simple wooden box with rope handles and a clasp that had once been locked but now hung open, the small padlock rusted through and broken. Thomas crouched beside it, his knees cracking again, and he lifted the lid, and the hinges moved smoothly as if they'd been waiting for this moment, oiled and ready to spite the years. Inside the chest, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had yellowed to the color of old ivory, were letters, dozens of them, maybe more, tied in bundles with string that crumbled slightly when Thomas touched it, and beneath the letters were other things. Blueprints rolled and secured with rubber bands that had long ago lost their elasticity and now fell away like dead skin. A journal bound in leather with pages dense with handwriting. A small wooden box that rattled when he picked it up. And inside held brass buttons stamped with eagles. And at the very bottom, folded with military precision, a flag. Thomas sat on the floor of the workshop with his legs crossed and the chest open before him like a book he was about to read, and Sam, who had followed him inside, lay down beside him and put his head on Thomas's knee, and together they stayed there as the light shifted and the day moved on without them. The first letter he opened was dated June 1953, written in pencil on paper, so thin it was nearly transparent, and the handwriting was careful, each letter formed with the deliberation of someone who didn't write often but wanted to be understood. Dear Mary, it began, I am writing to you from a place I cannot name, doing work I cannot describe. But I want you to know I am safe, and I am thinking of you and of the home we will build when this is finished. Thomas read slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because they felt sacred, private, like something he was eavesdropping on across the decades. And yet he couldn't stop, couldn't put them down, because in these letters he recognized something of himself. The voice of a man trying to hold on to the idea of home while being far from it, trying to remember what peace felt like while living in its absence. There were letters from Mary, too, responses saved and cherished. Dearest James, they said, the house is so quiet without you. I've been working in the garden, and I think of how you used to say that anything worth doing is worth doing slowly, with attention, and I try to bring that to the tomatoes and the beans and the flowers I'm planting for when you come back. Thomas read until his eyes ached and the light through the dirty window turned orange with late afternoon, and he learned that James had planned to build a cabin when he returned, a place away from the noise and crowds, somewhere with trees and water and silence, where he could work with his hands and remember what it meant to create rather than destroy. The blueprints showed the cabin from every angle, drawn with the same meticulous care as the letters, dimensions noted, materials listed, small annotations in the margins. Stone chimney, like my grandfather's, and window here, east-facing, for morning light, and porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a table between. The journal was harder to read, not because of the handwriting, but because of what it contained. Entries that started calm and measured and slowly, page by page, became more fragmented, more urgent, the handwriting looser, the dates less regular. November 8th. Can't sleep. The sounds follow me even here. November 23rd. Mary writes that she's waiting. I don't know how to tell her that the man she's waiting for is already gone. December 2nd. Maybe if I build the cabin, I can build myself back. Start with the foundation. Start with something solid. The last entry was dated January 15th, 1954, and it said only this, forgive me. I tried. Thomas closed the journal and sat with it in his lap. and he understood without needing to be told that James had never built the cabin, that something had broken in him the way something had broken in Thomas, that the shack outside with its rotting boards and sagging roof was all that remained of that dream. The foundation laid, but nothing else, the beginning of something that never had a chance to continue. If this story is reaching into your chest and touching something there, stay with us. You're not alone in feeling what you're feeling right now. He looked at the blueprints again, and this time he saw them differently, not as relics of failure, but as instructions, as a gift left by someone who couldn't finish what he'd started, but had at least drawn the map for whoever might come after. The cabin in the drawings was beautiful in its simplicity. One large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, windows on 3 sides, a porch that wrapped around 2 corners, and everywhere the evidence of thought, of care, of someone imagining not just shelter but home. Thomas stood, his legs stiff from sitting, and he walked back into the main room of the shack and looked at it with new eyes. And he realized that this wasn't just a building, it was a promise half-kept, a sentence interrupted mid-word. And he thought, maybe I can finish it. Maybe that's why I'm here, to complete what someone else began, to take this broken thing and make it whole. Not for James, who was long gone. Not for Mary, who had probably waited and then stopped waiting and moved on with her life, but for himself, for the man he might still become if he could just learn to build something instead of watching everything fall apart. He gathered the blueprints and the journal and one of the letters. He chose the first one, the one full of hope and longing, and he brought them into the main room and spread them on the table he'd set upright, and he studied them in the firelight. And for the first time in years, maybe since before the war, maybe since childhood, he felt something that might have been purpose, a reason to wake up that wasn't just survival, but creation, the ancient human impulse to take what is broken and make it better, to take what is empty and fill it with meaning. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the sky the color of coals, and the temperature was dropping fast, and Thomas knew he had hours of work ahead just to get through another night. Wood to gather and water to haul, and a fire to maintain. But as he rolled up the blueprints and placed them carefully on the mantel beside the photograph and the medal and the letter, he felt lighter, younger, as if some weight he'd been carrying had been shared with someone across time, as if James had reached forward through the decades and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Here, let me help you carry this. I know how heavy it gets." Sam barked once, sharp and sudden, and Thomas turned to see a deer at the edge of the clearing, a doe watching them with dark eyes, and the 3 of them, man and dog and deer, held still in that moment, each acknowledging the other's right to be there, to exist, to continue, and then the doe turned and melted back into the forest, and the moment passed, and Thomas got to work. Winter came in earnest, the way truth does when you've stopped running from it, all at once and without apology. And the snow fell thick and steady for 3 days until the world disappeared beneath a blanket. So why'd it hurt to look at when the sun finally broke through on the 4th morning, and Thomas stood in the doorway of the shack with his hands wrapped around a cup of hot water. He'd run out of coffee on day 2, and watched the light play across the surface of the snow, millions of crystals catching fire and going dark, like the whole forest was breathing in Morse code, sending messages he was only beginning to learn how to read. He had spent those 3 days inside, keeping the fire going, rationing what little food he had left, studying the blueprints until he could see them in his sleep, until he knew every measurement, every joint, every place where beam would meet post and roof would meet wall, and in the margins of the journal, on pages James had left blank, as if he'd known someone might need the space someday. Thomas had begun to make lists. Materials he would need, tools he would have to improvise or find, the order in which things would have to happen, because you can't build a roof before you build walls, can't build walls before you pour a foundation, can't pour a foundation before you clear the ground and dig down past the frost line and set the stones that will bear all the weight of everything that comes after. It was ambitious, maybe impossible for one man working alone with almost nothing, but Thomas had learned in the war that impossible was just another word for difficult, and difficult was just another word for slow, and slow was something he had plenty of now. All the time in the world measured not in hours, but in seasons, in the patient accumulation of small victories that might, if he was lucky and careful and didn't give up, add up to something that looked like redemption, or at least shelter, which was sometimes the same thing. The first tool he made was a shovel, fashioned from a flat piece of metal he'd found in the debris. Part an old stove, maybe, or a car hood, and lashed to a sapling he'd cut and stripped and smoothed with the plane from James's workshop. And it wasn't pretty, but it worked, and he used it to clear the snow from the area where the foundation would go, 50 feet from the shack, in a spot where the ground was relatively flat and the trees opened up enough to let in light, but still provided. Windbreak from the north, and as he worked, scooping and throwing, his breath coming in clouds, sweat soaking through his layers despite the cold, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, which was the simple satisfaction of physical labor undertaken with purpose. The knowledge that every shovelful of snow removed was one shovelful closer to something real, something that would last. Sam followed him everywhere, occasionally stopping to dig his own holes for reasons known only to dogs, and sometimes Thomas would pause and lean on his makeshift shovel and watch Sam's tail wagging as he excavated some fascinating smell, and he would laugh. Actually laugh, a sound so rusty from disuse it surprised him. And he would think, we're a team now, you and me, two half-broken things figure it out together, and that's not nothing, that's something, maybe even everything. If you're finding comfort in this slow work, in this quiet rebuilding, subscribe and join us here, where the fire's always warm and there's room for one more. On the 7th day, he'd started marking them on the wall with charcoal, one line for each sunrise. Thomas walked the 7 miles back to town, his pack empty except for the blueprints and a list written in careful block letters. And he went to the hardware store where men in clean coats looked at him with expressions he'd learned not to take personally, and he explained what he needed: cedar shingles, roofing nails, window glass, tar paper, a bag of cement, and the owner, a man with gray hair and hands that showed he'd done real work once, studied the blueprints for a long time without saying anything, and finally asked, "You're doing this yourself?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said, and his voice was steady because it was the truth. "You got money?" "Not yet," Thomas admitted, "but I will. I can work. Whatever needs doing." The owner looked at him for another long moment, and something passed between them that was older than words, the recognition of one man by another, and he said, "I need the back lot cleared. Trees cut, stumps pulled, brush piled. Hard work. Take you 3 weeks, maybe 4. I'll pay minimum wage, and you can take materials against your earnings." "Deal." Thomas felt something tighten in his throat, and he stuck out his hand, and they shook, and the deal was made the old way, on grip and eye contact, and the fragile trust that still exists sometimes between people who understand that a man's word is all he has when everything else is gone. He worked at the hardware store through January and into February, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, cutting trees in cold that made his hands ache even through gloves, pulling stumps with a come-along and chains, splitting wood and stacking it in neat ricks. And every Friday the owner, his name was Walter, and he'd served in Korea, and he never mentioned it, but Thomas could tell by the way he moved. The careful economy of motion that combat veterans carry like a signature. Walter would tally up the hours, and Thomas would take half in cash and half in materials, and the pile of supplies beside the shack grew slowly. Lumber and nails, bags of cement that Thomas carried one at a time through the forest, roofing felt and flashing, a window with real glass still intact in a frame that only needed minor repair. The widow from a neighboring property. He hadn't known there was a neighboring property until she appeared one afternoon, walking the old logging road with a basket covered in a red cloth. Her name was Anne, and she'd been there 30 years, and she'd known James, or known of him. And when Thomas told her what he was trying to do, she smiled in a way that made her face young again, and she said, "He'd be glad, I think. He'd be glad someone finished it." She brought him soup every Sunday, still hot in a mason jar wrapped in towels, and sometimes bread, and once a jar of honey from hives she kept at the edge of her own property, and she never stayed long or asked questions that went too deep, only offered what she could and left quietly. And Thomas learned that there are kindnesses that don't need words, that the greatest gift you can give someone who's rebuilding is to believe they can do it without making them prove it first. By March, the ground had thawed enough to dig, and Thomas spent 2 weeks with a pickaxe and shovel. A real one now, steel blade and ash handle, breaking through roots and rocks, carving out the foundation trench, 3 feet deep, following the blueprint's measurements exactly because James had known what he was doing, had calculated frost lines and drainage and load-bearing requirements. And Thomas honored that knowledge by doing it right, slowly, one shovelful at a time. A boy appeared one morning, maybe 10 years old, standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his pockets and curiosity written all over his face. And Thomas stopped digging and leaned on the shovel and said, "Morning." "Morning," the boy said. "What are you building?" "A cabin," Thomas said. "By yourself?" "Mostly." The boy thought about this. "Can I help?" Thomas looked at him, scuffed shoes, jacket too thin for the lingering cold, eyes that were bright and interested and lonely in the way that boys get lonely when they need to be useful. And he said, "You know how to measure twice and cut once?" "No, sir." "Well then," Thomas said, "I guess I'll have to teach you." The boy's name was Danny, and he lived with his grandmother in town, and he came every Saturday after that, and Thomas taught him to read a tape measure and drive a nail straight and mix them into the right consistency. Not too wet, not too dry. And the work went faster with 2 sets of hands, but more than that, it went lighter because teaching someone is a way of remembering why you're doing something in the first place, a way of making it matter beyond just yourself. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the way hope returns after long absence. First the snow pulling back from the southern slopes, then the ice breaking up in the creek with sounds like gunshots echoing through the valley, then the first shoots of green pushing up through the wet earth, so bright they looked painted, unreal, like they'd been imported from some other planet where colors still meant something. And Thomas, standing on the porch of the cabin he'd built with his own hands and borrowed, tools and the ghost of a man named James guiding him through the blueprint. Thomas watched the season turn and felt something in himself turning with it, some long-frozen part thawing, aching as it woke, but waking nonetheless. The cabin stood solid now, true, its corners square and its roof tight and its windows, 3 of them, just like the plans had specified, catching the light in ways that made the interior feel twice as large as it was. And inside there was a table he'd built from planks Walter had given him, 2 chairs with seats he'd woven from rope the way his grandfather had shown him a lifetime ago, a sleeping loft with a mattress and had donated after Thomas had protested, and she'd said, in a voice that allowed no argument, that her husband was dead 10 years and the mattress was just taking up space, and would Thomas please for the love of heaven let an old woman feel useful? And he'd carried it home through the forest with Danny's help, the 2 of them laughing at how awkward it was, how it caught on every branch, how Sam kept trying to climb on top of it like it was a sled. The stone fireplace, that had been the hardest part and the best part, the work that had taken him 2 months of gathering rocks from the creek bed and hauling them up the hill and fitting them together with mortar mixed from the cement he'd earned. And he'd done it slowly, carefully, 1 stone at a time, thinking about James as he worked, thinking about his own grandfather, thinking about all the men who'd ever built anything with their hands and left it behind for whoever came next. And when he'd finally set the last stone and stepped back to look at it, he felt something close to joy, or maybe it was just satisfaction, but it was clean and pure and unmarked by doubt, and he'd known in that moment that he'd done something that mattered, something that would outlast him, something that would stand long after his hands had forgotten how to grip a trowel. The garden he'd planted in April, vegetables mostly tomatoes and beans and squash, following advice from and who knew this soil and what would grow in it, was coming up strong, neat rows of green against the dark earth, and every morning Thomas would walk through it with his coffee. Walter had given him a pound as a bonus for finishing the lot clearing early, and he'd check each plant, pulling weeds, adjusting stakes, talking to them the way, and had said her husband used to, because plants are living things, and living things respond to attention, to the knowledge that someone is paying attention, that someone cares whether they live or die. Danny came by less often now that school was back in session, but he still showed up most Saturdays, taller than he'd been in March, his voice starting to crack in that way that means childhood is ending and something else is beginning. And Thomas would put him to work. There was always work, the kind that never ends, repairs and improvements and projects that created more projects, and they'd labor together in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by questions from Danny about how to do things or why things worked the way they did. And Thomas would explain as best he could. And in explaining, he'd discover that he knew more than he'd thought, that somewhere along the way he'd accumulated knowledge worth passing on, which was its own kind of wealth. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a place where you can hear the wind? Where you can imagine a fire burning and understand why that matters? One evening in May, and came by with a pie, rhubarb, tart and sweet at once. And she sat on the porch with Thomas as the sun went down, turning the sky the color of salmon flesh. And they didn't talk much, only watched the light fade and listened to the birds settling in for the night and the creek running full with snow melt from higher up the mountain. And after a while and said, "You've done good here, Thomas. Real good." And Thomas said, "Thank you," because sometimes that's all there is to say. Sometimes gratitude is the only honest response to kindness. And they sat there a while longer, and went home, walking the logging road with the empty pie tin under her arm, and Thomas stayed on the porch with Sam at his feet, now well-fed and glossy-coated and devoted in the absolute way that dogs are devoted when you've saved them and they know it. The letter, the one he'd carried for 11 years, the one from his ex-wife that he'd never opened. Thomas finally read it one night in June, sitting by the fire with the windows open to let in the smell of pine and earth and growing things, and it said what he'd always known it would say, which was that she was sorry, that she'd tried, that she hoped he'd find peace, that Jacob asked about him sometimes, and she didn't know what to say except the truth, which was that his father had gone, somewhere inside himself, and couldn't find the way back, but maybe someday he would, and if he did, the door was open, not to return to that was impossible, they both knew it, but to be part of what came next in whatever way he could manage. Thomas folded the letter and put it back in his pocket, and he didn't cry, but his eyes burned, and he sat very still for a long time, and eventually he took out the paper and pencil he bought in town, and he wrote back, not explaining, not apologizing, because words couldn't carry that weight, but just telling her what he'd built, that he was trying, that he thought about Jacob every day, that he understood if it was too late, but if it wasn't, if there was any chance he'd like to try being a father again, even if it was only letters at first, even if it was only slow and careful and full of the awkwardness of strangers learning each other from scratch. He mailed the letter the next morning, and he didn't know if anything would come of it, didn't let himself hope too hard, because hope, he'd learned, was something you had to ration when you'd been disappointed as many times as he had. But he'd taken the step, had reached out across the distance he'd created, and that was something, that was enough for now. Summer deepened, and the cabin settled into itself, the wood drying and tightening, the foundation firm beneath it, and Thomas settled, too, into a rhythm that felt ancient and right. Wake with the sun, tend the garden, work on whatever project needed working on, eat simple food, read from James's journal in the evenings, sleep hard and dreamless in the loft with Sam on a blanket at the foot of the bed and the sound of the forest breathing through the open windows. Walter offered him permanent work at the hardware store, part-time, enough to keep him in supplies and food with a little left over, and Thomas accepted because isolation, he discovered, wasn't the same as peace. You needed other people, needed to be useful to them, needed to feel like you were part of something larger than yourself, even if you live alone in the woods. And the work was good, honest, the kind where you came home tired but satisfied, and Walter never asked questions about where Thomas had been or why he'd ended up here, only treated him with the quiet respect of one veteran for another, which was worth more than any therapy Thomas had ever sat through. In August, a letter arrived, not from Julie, but from Jacob, 12 years old now, and writing in careful cursive about school and baseball, and a book he'd read about a man who built a cabin in the woods and lived there for 2 years. And he said, "Mom told me what you're doing, and it sounds cool, and maybe sometime I could visit." And Thomas sat on the porch with that letter in his hands, and the sun warm on his face and tears running down into his beard. And he thought, yes, you can visit, you can come, I'll teach you to build things, and we'll fish in the creek, and maybe we can figure out how to be father and son again, a different way than before, but still something, still real. The first frost came in September, earlier than and had predicted, and Thomas spent the day harvesting what was left of the garden and storing it in the root cellar he'd dug. Another project, another skill learned, and as he worked he thought about the year that had passed, about the man who'd stood at the county auction and bid $1 on a wreck, and walked away with people's laughter following him like smoke. And he thought about that man with something like tenderness, like looking at a photograph of yourself from childhood and recognizing the face, but barely remembering being that person. And he understood that transformation isn't dramatic, isn't a single moment of revelation, but rather the patient accumulation of days lived with intention, of choices made toward building rather than destroying, of mornings when you wake up and decide simply to continue. That evening, as the sun set and the temperature dropped and the first stars appeared in the sky, so clear it looked like you could reach up and touch the fabric of space itself, Thomas sat on the porch with Danny, who'd brought his grandmother by to see the finished cabin, and had come too, and even Walter had driven out. Rare for him to leave the store, but he'd wanted to see it complete, and they sat together, the five of them if you counted Sam, who absolutely should be counted, and they shared bread and cheese and the last of Anne's summer preserves, and they didn't need to say much because the cabin said it for them, stood there solid and true and full of the promise that broken things could be mended, that lost people could be found, that a dollar and a dream and the willingness to work could create something that mattered. If this story moved you, if it touched something you thought was too broken to heal, subscribe and stay with us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, what you're building, what you're trying to mend. We're building something together here, 1,000 hearts around 1,000 fires, and maybe yours is the one we've been waiting for. Maybe we're the ones you've been looking for too. Thomas looked at the people around him, at the dog asleep on the boards, at the cabin standing quiet and strong with smoke rising from the chimney and light glowing warm in the windows, and he thought about James, dead 70 years now, probably buried in some place Thomas would never know. And he thought, I finished it for you, brother, I finished what you started, and in doing so I finished something in myself too, something I thought was beyond repair, and he hoped that somehow, somewhere, James knew that the act of one man completing another man's abandoned dream had created some kind of bridge across time, some proof that we're all connected, all part of the same long story of people trying to build homes in a world that keeps tearing them down. And sometimes, if we're lucky and stubborn and willing to begin again with nothing but a blueprint and hope, sometimes we succeed. The fire crackled, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the night deepened around them, and they sat together in the warmth and the light. And for that moment at least, everything was exactly as it should be, and Thomas was home.